back to another lecture reading. My name is Melinda Cole Klein. Why in 1492 did Columbus sail the ocean blue? The drive to explore the Atlantic and its oceanic islands has been a topic of scholarly inquiry for a long time. But recently in 2006, Dr. Brian Fagan in Fish on Friday offered a fresh perspective on this line of inquiry. This notable professor of archaeology, anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, pointed out in a most interesting study that factors of fish eating, religion, and commerce encourage shipbuilding and advances in Western maritime technology to which nation-states competed economically in a response to market demands. As European national interests competed for fishing rights, this industry witnessed innovation, even though it was a long time coming, in food preservation, oceanic navigational ability, and knowledge. This allowed Western European mariners to venture far afield for new sources of fish, while the trade in salt became ever more important over time. While the lucrative industry rose and fell, factors of political power and environmental challenges stressed oceanic voyages and the men who sailed in these medieval vessels. Far from home and working under extreme conditions. Early mariners kept their secrets close to the vest. Economic livelihoods depended on it, century after century. The title of my lecture is England's Henry VII and Imperial Competition, Cod, Christianity, and Late 15th Century Atlantic Exploration. Historical categories that I have included are as follows: politics, trade, and commerce, market demands for fish, England's King Henry VII and Atlantic exploration, Bristol merchants, fishermen, and explorers, fish preservation, salt, and storage, medieval fish-eating habits increased, followed by Iceland and trade in cod, fish fasting and true penitence, along with Atlantic fishing outposts, port trade, and ponding, and fish dietary reforms and piety. Good Christians today and over the centuries have eaten fish 1 to 3 days a week as an outwardly sign of piety. This dietary principle, advocated by religious authority, drove market demands for salt and freshwater fish, including, this would be salmon, eels, and we would also find saltwater sources as well, including cod and herring. Spawning seasons offered opportunities for villagers to engage in harvesting quantities of fish. However, fishing techniques were slow to evolve. The range included catching freshwater fish by hand, catching schools of fish in nets, to casting a line into water or using a spear. For eels and for some fish by type, meshed wicker traps worked best. Fish preservation demanded the importation of salt from tropical climes such as northern Africa. Fish preservation techniques tried to keep up with market-driven demands. Accordingly, recipes contained seafood or fish products adapted to tastes as cooks and fishmongers tried to mask its odors for the pious. Fish were kept alive for as long as possible to stretch their freshness. As noted by scholars, the canning or refrigeration techniques did not exist. Thus, live storage of perishable items such as seafood and fish was one of the ways these items could be kept alive as long as possible. This typically took the form of storage tanks and small, temporary fish ponds. As Christian European cities became repopulated by the 11th century, long-distance trade was resumed. This created economic competition between trading nations, to which a thriving market resulted, and fish, as a commodity, is a part of this history. It fed the pious, both rich and poor, along with armies, navies, and those receiving charity until modern times. Early Christian fathers argued that an outwardly sign of true piety was to abstain from certain meats and substitute meals with fish and eel. The Greeks and Romans had considered fish as the preferred food of the gods. In their belief system, eating fish, especially at funeral feasts, was a practice that symbolized a connection with the dead. Accordingly, this culture, in regards to fish, was the food preferred in the afterlife. For early Christians, true piety required a measure of abstinence. And Friday became the most revered day of piety, as this day was the one on which Jesus was executed on the cross. In addition, the Bible and to the teachings of Jesus, fish found approval. Fish on Fridays has been a practice for going on 2,000 years. By the turn of the first millennia, there became a great demand by governments and the Catholic Church to provide armies and navies with a lightweight food resource. Dried fish and the biscuit-like hardtack would fit the bill for centuries. This need promoted from the early 1000s a vibrant trade in grains and also fostered a demand in fish. These foods were easily transported and stored, thus creating an enormous trade across Europe in dried, salted, or smoked fish, especially cod and herring. Because herring spoiled quickly, it had to be heavily salted and or smoked. Cod, on the other hand, if cooked correctly, could prove to be most satisfying, while it could be preserved easily. And because of this, it was easily portable. It would emerge as a preferred food for those traveling long distances, such as sailors, soldiers, and fishermen. As a white fish, it pairs well with sauces and a variety of spices and vegetables, along with other meats, such as bacon. The British have made a traditional meal out of cod, with the Victorian-style deep-fried cod served with French-fried potatoes. By the 1000s, this century witnessed a great demand for easily transportable food products, as mentioned, for example, to supply armies and navies. Among these were dried, salted, or smoked fish. And for this reason, this drove commercial demand for fish, while advances in preservation techniques lagged sadly behind the demand for this market good. All the while, a great demand for salt continued. Scholars have estimated that herring soaked in watery brine would have included 80 to 100% salt. In time, pickled fish was developed in which fish with a high salt content would store well. It would be during this century, with dietary demands of Christianity combined with a rising population rate, that fish became a commodity in constant demand, locally and for value to governments across Europe. And it would be the large fish commonly known as cod that would entice fishermen to find these easy-to-catch white fish. Some say this drove advances in seaworthy vessels and navigational skills. To find this fish, indeed, it would take different boat designs along with skilled mariners waiting and willing to sail in the direction of the Grand Banks in the North Atlantic, where this large-bodied fish often would swarm in great schools, and it would be here that it would be found. It would be the Norwegians who would lead the way in trade with Iceland for cod. While their boats could only carry small cargo loads, the trade and exchange of European grain for cod created a vibrant economy over the centuries. With this union in regards to 1269, Iceland became a protectorate of Norway. The trade in cod would expand because of this union. Prior to this political alliance, other nations had traded freely with Iceland as they brought for exchange much needed commodities such as manufactured cloth and, as I mentioned already, grain. But this changed after 1269. From this date, Norwegian ships were authorized to carry trade commodities to and from Iceland. For Eastern English, Irish, and Scots mariners and those of the Hanseatic League, Norway had forbid direct trade with Iceland. As scholars have identified, the demand for fish combined with direct access to it drove up the price of fish. This increased the demand for mariners, to which the search for new fish sources needed to take place. As other European nations created trade sanctions, this motivated mariners and non-alliance governments, such as the Scots, to continue their bartering trade in fish that could be had in exchange for whiskey, woolen cloth, and sometimes coin. Scholars have been able to support the fact that the Norse traded with islands in the North Atlantic dating back to the 900s. This sea travel, far from the sight of land, coincides with the Great Warming period spanning from 900 to 1300 AD. In these conditions, great ice packs were twice as far from shore as they would be later during the Little Ice Age, generally considered from 1300 to 1850. During the Great Warming, such conditions in Iceland, for example, would allow greater access to shore fishing and seal hunting during the medieval warming than before or after this 400-year period. And for the Norse that took up residence in North America, to Iceland and Greenland, these colonists grew hay for their dairy cows along with barley and grains. In North America, settlers grew grapes, and Greenland colonists wrote home about milder winter conditions. By the 1200s, extensive and self-supporting agricultural activities had become increasingly difficult because of colder winters or unseasonable weather. This made these fishing outposts more dependent on their European traders for day-to-day commodities such as grain and cloth staples. And the one commodity they had in abundance was fish and seal products. In such economic conditions, it would be the Norse who would create an industry from the trade in fish. In time, they would create size, preservation, and packaging standards. To coin a phrase, cod in particular would be worth its weight in gold, as it would feed warring nations of the world along with the pious across the economic spectrum. A variety of fish could be found at the medieval table. Among them would be eels, salmon, cod, and herring. Fish and eel could be served in soups, baked in pies, or served as an entree. Ponding using natural boundaries, such as at the base of waterfalls, proved effective for monks who aimed to adhere to dietary guidelines. Until more fish from the sea could be available at markets, those with land resources, such as the clergy and landed nobles, would create inland ponds. As pointed out by Dr. Brian Fagan, there has been little scholarly attention given to the eating habits of the clergy and community members, while archaeological excavations have identified a, quote, profound change in fish-eating habits, end of quote. Additionally, accounts kept regarding kitchen orders and parties entertained would prove useful if they could be found in monastic and estate records. To say the least, this would be a most entertaining and enlightening research. To be honest, I am surprised with the lack of interest among scholars. While the Norse would perfect the salt brining process for herring by the 900s, reliable supplies of fish could not meet market demands from lakes, streams, and/or ponds. Near port cities, monks had better access to fresh fish supplies from fishermen than those from outlying areas reliant on fishmongers. And depending on the fish by type, this type of food had a hierarchy and a rank. Thus, certain fish were in demand by different groups of society. In practice, monks were expected to eat fish no less than 215 days a year. Their portions were hefty, as they averaged, apparently, between 21 and 30 ounces respectively, as identified by scholars. Yes, the average medieval monk was overweight, as it has been tallied that they consumed, apparently, between 4,870 calories during non-Lent days and 3,350 calories per day during Lent. While the poor and soldiers would likely be given meager portions and low-quality fish, scholars have noted that 14th century English soldiers, for example, stationed in Scotland ate what amounted to fish served on 122 days. To say the least, for the common village wife, acquiring fish for even half of the year must have proved very challenging. With 52 weeks in the year, and 3 days of these to be given as fish days, at least at a minimum. This translates to 156 fish days in which this particular meat would be served at dinner. Not to mention special days, including religious holidays, community feast days, and then of course there's the family holidays as well, such as weddings, funerals, births. Monastic houses offered banquets to honor guests and visiting dignitaries. These, as a type of feast, like done at landed estates, including a variety of game, fish, and seafood. Fish, depending on the type, could be quite expensive and difficult to obtain. When notable fish were available from the docks, messengers were sent out to prospective cooks, to which items would be carted out promptly. And the rarer the fish, like logic would support, the more costly it was. And it would be these rare delicacies from the sea that would impress visiting dignitaries. Good food became a sign of wealth and exalted status. To meet this end, monasteries to houses of the nobility turned to creating their own sources of fish with the use of ponding. But this solution had its shortcomings, particularly when it came to self-sufficiency. And because of this problem of supply, strict dietary guidelines regarded and required in-time reforms. Leading the way would be 11th century Benedictines. The rule of Saint Benedict, while it restricted consumption of four-legged animals, those who followed the rules found no fault over time, including some game with the occasional chicken. And because the beaver was fish-like, this was an acceptable alternative in some areas. But without a doubt, the eating of fish for the devout became quintessential to acquire and serve at one's table. Because we have tax and surviving economic records, historians are familiar with fish catches and volumes put up for sale or as forms of tribute. Additionally, monastic records offer a glimpse into the trade of fish. While trade expanded during the Great Warming period, the population grew in numbers. This challenged access to land and resources, driving the ever more growing demand to feed one's nation. During the medieval period, trade networks expanded across Europe as port towns became centers of commerce. While the fishermen risked life and limb to acquire cod and other fish in waters far to the north, it was not they who profited beyond the subsistence level. It would be the merchant traders found in port cities across Europe that would drive the need to retain commercial activity. After all, the fish industry proved most profitable to the merchant class. All right, let's move on to another aspect of this history. I wanted to share with you, you might not be aware, but these two books by Williamson are most informative as scholarly sources. James A. Williamson wrote the most interesting book. This research effort titled The Cabot Voyages and Bristol Discovery under Henry VII. This was published in 1962 by Cambridge University Press. In it, Williamson targets, as I've noted here for you, the history behind the mythical island of Brazil, Bristol Merchant Ventures of the 1480s, and the Voyages of John Cabot. This author, scholar, historian, also published earlier in 1929 the Voyages of the Cabots and the Discovery of North America. Fishermen, among others, are famous for keeping their secrets close to their chest. For this reason, historians often run into dead ends when investigating the past. But during the 1400s, prior to the voyages of Columbus, there were Englishmen who sailed out of Bristol that traded with Icelandic settlers. As the Portuguese and French were more interested in rounding Africa, English fishermen ventured far west into the North Atlantic. All the while, merchants of Venice and Genoa had firm trade alliances with Muslims. Unwilling to deal with Muslims at any level, Iberian seafaring traders explored the African coast and established port trading towns on islands and the mainland. The English had no such alliances, and in the shadow of the Hanseatic League that controlled commercial trade across northern Europe, the port city of Bristol, and Bristol is located in eastern England, continued its trade with those willing. However, seaworthy craft and capital needed for long-distance voyages would continue to plague family enterprises, especially in light of the fact of high rates of death or damages incurred from fishing voyages. Thus, the English sea ventures, though sparsely noted in the historical record, continued to voyage west prior to the sailing of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Not only the English, but the Spanish were interested in locating islands in the Atlantic. Geographically, they could become important trade centers and resupplying depots to the governments that controlled access to them. In The History of the Indies, monk Bartolomé de las Casas recalls his reading of the journal entries of Christopher Columbus. Prior to approaching the Spanish government, Columbus was able to gain the confidence of mariners who were accustomed with the sailing to the Azores and Madeira. However, to the west, the mariners told Columbus of unknown islands, and it would be found by the people of the Azores a man who would wash ashore who came from western islands and lands. During the reign of Henry VII, the customs records, though incomplete, have listed a number of trading entries between Iceland and Bristol merchants or fishermen. So the English government knew of the existence of islands in the northwest and perhaps more beyond. In addition, Bristol merchants in the 1480s and the 90s had been sailing northern latitudes of the Atlantic for reasons of commercial expansion. It is possible that Norse voyages to Vineland in North America still circulated secretly among seamen of Ireland, Scotland, and eastern England, or this active port in particular among the Bristol mariners. As history would unfold, it would be this northwestern direction that had been utilized by English sea ventures that King Henry VII would be convinced to pursue later with John Cabot. Thus, Columbus's offer to sail for the English king was turned down. Now, I have a little bit more to say about this because according to Spanish sources and also English government sources, this meeting that has appeared in literature and also in art forms is not substantiated with evidence. So according to the official response, this meeting never took place. Christopher Columbus was not the first explorer to venture across the Atlantic. This story is more complicated. There's more people involved here. It's not as simple. As Columbus recalled later in his journals, he traveled aboard an English vessel that sailed out of Western England on a Bristol port ship, and this apparently sailed to Iceland. According to his own biography, as a teenager, Columbus was inspired to sail across the Atlantic because of the stories he heard from the English and Irish sailors that he met. It has been claimed that King Henry VII of England turned down Columbus's proposal in 1487, as I mentioned, as presented apparently by the navigator's brother. But historical research has no government evidence from either England or Spain to support this meeting that it ever took place. What is clear is that Henry VII was aware by 1490 that Bristol merchants desired Atlantic exploration and the Crown's consent. From 1480, English merchants had been sailing west into the Atlantic in search of these islands and those not mentioned. Maps of the period identified an island called Bristol, and it could be found, apparently, 150 miles out to sea, west of Ireland. This mythical island was still considered a real place in Irish lore until it was proven otherwise in the 19th century. While in America, Christopher Columbus is taught exclusively that he discovered the Americas. This simplistic view, at least what I want you to remember, is often taken at face value, and it did involve other people. While this history does not seem to get into textbooks, it's obvious that Columbus stood on the shoulders of the mariners he met and spent time with. He gambled. Luck, determination, and Spanish funding played significant roles in the first voyage by Columbus. Additionally, the Northern Europeans, not the Iberians, had the longer history of building skills and navigation past the side of land prior to 1450. The Iberians, yes, would perfect the caravel as a sailing vessel by this year. 3 decades later, prior to Columbus, documented English mariners made voyages west of Ireland. It is likely other ventures took place as well. After all, European commerce was driven by competition. After Spain benefited by the efforts of Columbus, in 1496, the English government did pursue exploration for cod, known to frequent the North Atlantic. And it would be during the voyage by John Cabot to Newfoundland that set into motion the interest by the British government to establish fishing colonies along North American seaboard areas. This English interest in fishing did not end in the 15th century. Well known to history were the Puritans. Their colonial venture, known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, would acquire the Royal Fishing Charter to establish a colony in New England. And that they did. of the English colonies settling North America, it would be Massachusetts that would make its mark on the developing mercantilist economy of the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, once again, this brings us to an end of my lecture reading. Thank you for your time and attention.